Hi, I'm Deadra Welcome, founder and CEO of Concerning Learning. Just to share a little bit about me, I am a passionate learner myself. I enjoy helping others learn, and I love the profession that I'm in, which is the learning and development profession, or this year we are calling it talent development. We change our name, but we always stay focused on making learning extraordinary, which is what Concerning Learning does. So I started Concerning Learning in 2011 just as an outlet for me to make learning extraordinary for others. I was tired of sitting in classes, training rooms, and not really getting what I needed to perform on the job. So I decided, let's start Concerning Learning so that we can actually deliver those results. We can really make an impact and help people be extraordinary in their profession. Just recently, I left federal service after 27 years in the federal government. It was truly a breeding ground for this passion that I have for learning. I started as an accidental trainer. And what that means is I graduated from college, I needed a job, the training coordinator was retiring and needed someone to backfill for her. So here I come. I am the new training coordinator and have been in learning and development for over 20 years as a result of being an accidental trainer. Now, I will say that my development has not been accidental. As I mentioned before, I am a passionate learner myself. So I've learned all the different aspects of learning and development, from instructional design, performance consulting, designing, delivering, facilitating, evaluating, all those aspects or areas of expertise within the learning field. And it's as a result of my passion for helping others learn and make learning extraordinary. Now for Learning Revolution News. This is where we discuss topics of interest within the federal government, within nonprofit organizations, and the corporate world. In the government world, OPM conducted a study in 2016 about how to improve performance management among supervisors. Some of their key findings were 84% of the survey participants indicated that their agency's new supervisory training programs included mandatory training topics. But only 63% indicated that those same mandatory training topics were given to experienced supervisors in their training programs. So there's definitely an opportunity for improvement in the learning strategy and how experienced managers are developed versus new managers. Overall, the leadership programs needed to add more coaching opportunities. And these coaching opportunities allow managers to develop their employees, to practice those skills in order to lead their employees to maximize performance. There also needs to be more consistency on how agencies address their leadership development strategies. So my recommendation is to have a focused, extraordinary learning strategy that helps leaders within government positions achieve their best. You need to have the necessary components in order to really improve performance management, which was the reason why OPM conducted the study in the first place. Now, on to the nonprofit world. Not surprisingly, the same challenges exist within the nonprofit world. They have gaps in leadership development programs. According to a Quartz at Work article, nonprofit organizations are definitely suffering from a leadership gap. So there is another opportunity for an extraordinary learning strategy to help fill those gaps. Find out exactly what is necessary, what makes each organization different from the other, and target their strategy to solve and close those skill gaps. And lastly, on the corporate front, we're all familiar with all Starbucks were closed for a while so that the employees were able to attend one-day implicit bias training. Well, we all know that one day in training is not going to solve a culture that is not connecting with customers. So my recommendation for Starbucks is focus on the learning culture and make sure that that one-day event is incorporated into the overall extraordinary learning strategy. I'm going to talk more about that in Dedra's Learning Nuggets towards the end of the podcast. So I'd like to leave the Learning Revolution news with news about my friend Tim Slade and his new book, The E-Learner Designer's Handbook. Now, let me tell you a little about this book. It is my new go-to book, and I have added it to my library, my go-to library. I have a few books that I go to on a regular basis when I'm working on instructional design projects, and I've added Tim's to my library. The book hooks you from the beginning, and I think for me, there was a common story of that accidental instructional designer, which Tim was as well. So he makes it extremely practical and easy to use and walks you through the steps of instructional design and managing those projects from beginning to end. If you'd like to get a copy of Tim's book and stay connected, please look him up on timslade.com. Thank you, Tim, for your book. I will definitely use it on a regular basis. Our guest for this episode's The Best Learning Strategies comes from Australia. Welcome, Emma Weber.
Thank you. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to have my first guest be Emma Weber. And Emma is the CEO and founder of Lever Transfer of Learning. And in America, we say lever, but Lever Transfer of Learning. She's also the developer of the Turning Learning into Action methodology. So Emma's firm belief in the platform on which she has built her successful global business, and I mean global, wait until you hear these things, is that the key aim of learning in the workplace is to create tangible business benefits. She's established Lever to help organizations and their employees convert learning into effective action back on the job. Under her guidance, Lever now delivers TLA, Turning Learning into Action, throughout 20 countries and 12 languages. A recognized authority on the transfer of learning, Emma has been a guest speaker on learning effectiveness at conferences in Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, and the US. Her book, Turning Learning into Action, a proven methodology for effective transfer of learning, which I have my own personal copy of, was published in March 2014. And Emma's second book, Making Change Work, How to Create Behavioral Change in Organizations to Drive Impact and ROI, was co-authored by Jack and Patty Phillips of the ROI Institute and was published on May 3rd in 2016. So Emma, let me just tell you a little bit about Emma and my connection. So we met in 2016, and I was, as I was preparing for my talk with you, Emma, I said, okay, let me go through some emails and kind of see how this, when did we really start talking? And it was 2016, you had an event that I was so, graciously accepted the invitation to be a part of. And it was so exciting, which is when I got my book. And we followed up in a conversation, and it said, this is the first of many conversations we'll have. And I was like, wow, that has come full circle with this particular conversation.
Hasn't it just?
Yes. So I know the last time when we first met, we talked and we had so many conversations. So I'm glad to have you back, and we are continuing our conversation as we promised we would.
Thank you so much. It's so lovely to be a guest on your show, Deidre. Thank you.
Thank you. So I really want to just talk with you because, learning transfer is something that is near and dear to my heart as well, and something that I'm extremely passionate about. So imagine my surprise when I opened up my TD at Work
Mhm.
publication in the email, and I said, learning transfer. And I said, Emma, oh my gosh. So I started reading and couldn't put it down. And I said, you know what? I'm just going to ask Emma if she will be the first guest in the best learning strategy segment of my podcast. So with all of that, I just want to just have a conversation and let the podcast viewers, experience some of what you and I have been talking about for a number of years, which is learning transfer. And so just to get them a little familiar with what learning transfer is and turning learning into action methodology is about, can
Sure.
you just kind of share a little bit about the purpose of the L&D maturity model?
Yeah. So I think when we're talking learning transfer strategy, at its very base, it's around how do we create behavioral change in the organization as a result of the learning initiatives that we're creating. That's what the transfer is. It's when you transfer it from being a knowledge or learning to actually your day-to-day behaviors in a role. And the key thing is when you're looking at your learning transfer strategy, you really need to be thinking about, well, what's the maturity of learning within my organization? And that's why one of the things I was playing around with last year, I'm very happy to share it with ATD, and they did the publication, that you really need to start to think about, okay, well, what is the maturity of learning in my organization to be able to match your transfer strategy to that maturity? And when I'm looking at the maturity, I look at the learning's role in the business. So, what's the primary focus of learning? Is the focus on compliance training? Is the focus on delivering business results? Is the focus on, what's the real goal of learning within the organization? So we sort of consider that. Then we look at the business's role in learning. So how involved does the business get in learning? What's the collaboration between learning and the business? What sort of KPIs do the business have that links to learning? And then finally, we actually look at learning as an activity. So when we're designing learning, are we designing learning outcomes or are we designing organizational outcomes? What are the types of benefits that we are getting from learning as an activity within the organization? So and that sounds a little bit more complicated than it is, Deidre. So we've done you'll have seen it in the ATD report, the check boxes. So you can actually easily pinpoint where you are to then sort of say, okay, let's think about the different types of learning transfer strategy that I will need to create these results.
Absolutely. And I think that's what really, what I love about the TD at Work publications is they give you really practical knowledge, really practical applications and techniques. And so yours really resonated with me because my focus is learning strategy, and a learning strategy without transfer of learning throughout the entire strategy is pretty much a waste of time. Because as we, talked endlessly about, if you have learning, if you're doing learning activities, if you're evaluating, but there's no behavior change, what was the point? And so really building that strategy in is what I love about this, the model, the methodology, and the book. And so why is that learning strategy, learning transfer strategy so important to organizational performance? And I ask that because a lot of organizations feel like just having some learning activities, or let's just give some training. And once you've determined that there really is a gap in knowledge and skills, then what is the strategy for really closing those gaps, but taking it further? Because closing those gaps without really transferring it and applying it and then seeing it meet those results is, as we know, a waste of time. So I like the fact that, I'd like to hear from you. Why is it so important for those organizations to, really focus on the learning transfer?
So I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that, in a way, it's quite heartbreaking when we know how powerful learning can be within an organization and how powerful learning can be in helping create change and results within an organization. If, as learning professionals, we don't actually deliver the end change, or we feel that we're powerless to do that because the managers aren't supporting us, or once they've left the classroom or once they've read that module, that's our job done. So partly for me, it's because of an absolute passion for learning and knowing what that can deliver, that I think we just must get that transfer happening. And what I've seen is where organizations start to really get the transfer happening. We're working with a client down in Melbourne. They've been fantastic to get involved with. Started working with them last August. And this year, our financial year starts in July here. They've had a 4-fold uplift in training budget or learning budget for the learning department because they've started to show the organization's results from the investment that they've made. So I think as a profession, the more results that we generate, the more we will be valued.
Absolutely.
I think the second key thing is why it's so important in the strategy is that, we can see the world is changing around us. We're, this talk of post-automation workforces, what will that look like? We know that the soft skills and the people skills are where artificial intelligence and machines can't step in, certainly can't yet step in. And so these soft skills are going to be really, really essential to the success of our organizations. And those soft skills, when we need people to learn, change, reskill, get ready for new jobs, the transfer is important. We can't just treat it as a tick the box exercise if we want to survive and thrive as the world is changing. So, I can talk about this for hours, Deadra. So, and we do.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Like when you said that, I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, that is what we have been talking about for years now, that, we do our profession a disservice sometimes when we don't show how we're adding value. And so when the times when the budgets are cut and the training departments are cut, it's because we haven't shown how we can add value. And we know that those high performing organizations all have strong learning and development. They have a strong learning strategy. So it's important that not just for learning's sake, like we don't want a check the box activity, but for the organizational performance to actually achieve its mission and its goals, they need a strong learning strategy. So you mentioned the manager's role in this process. And so I'd like to take a focus on specifically, there's a transfer specialist that is important and a key and essential piece to this process. And so how does that transfer specialist compare to the role of a coach? Because we hear a lot of talking about coaching, executive coaching, but how does this transfer specialist differ from the traditional coach?
Yeah. And one of the things I think about coaching is everyone has a different experience and everyone has a different definition of coaching. And I think the whole thing about when you're talking about a transfer specialist and transfer is intrinsically linked to the learning. So you've already had a very powerful, always awareness building, awakening piece that will happen through the learning. So to then put transfer on that will create really efficient outcomes. Whereas if you have just coaching alone, a lot of that may be around creating awareness to even start a change process. I think also around coaching, you have so many different types of coaches. The thing about a transfer specialist is they really help the individual take ownership, because the more ownership the individual has, the more long-term and sustained the behavioral change will be. And they do that through the power of reflection in a very short, sharp, focused way. So for us, any transfer conversation we have is no longer than 30 minutes. And just having one conversation isn't going to create the difference, because it's really about a series of conversations but that may only be 3. We're not talking 6, 12 here. But it's the commitment that an individual makes on reflection and then holding them accountable to that. And certainly, coaching is at the heart or the core of a transfer specialist toolkit, but the rest of the tools are really built around the learning. So in a way, we could kind of get into all sorts of semantics, but I think the key is the reflection, leaving the ownership with the individual, empowering them to behavioral change, and that accountability piece.
Absolutely. And those are the pieces that are missing in many of the existing learning strategies, is that accountability. Because, they go to, and we know that needs to start at the beginning. Before the employee actually goes to training, there needs to be, what are the expectations of when you return, how I expect you or how we expect you to apply that, and then follow through afterwards. So the supervisor has a role as well as the transfer specialist, which I really like that it reinforces the need for action and not just going to training, but we expect something from that. So I love it.
Yeah. And Deidre, sometimes with the depending on the type of learning and there's different variables, but depending on the maturity of the organization and the level where the supervisor is in terms of the time and the skill they have to have follow-up conversations, the strategic imperative of the learning, and also the different the depth of the learning. So, for example, if it's a leadership training or a team leader training, they may need to get quite vulnerable to really look at what's holding them back from fully applying the learning, or to really get the benefit of it. Which sometimes to be that vulnerable with their supervisor or their line manager of the person who is, responsible for the next promotion can be difficult. We often have people sharing with us things that they've never voiced out loud before, and when they voice them, they perhaps realize they're not true and the barrier disappears and they can start to move forward. But you really need to create that space for vulnerability for that individual to truly change and really embrace the change, particularly if it's a soft skill around that leadership development piece. So it's quite fascinating, Deidra, when you actually get into the detail of what controls a human's behavior as well.
Absolutely. I love it. We could talk all day about this.
We will.
So, yes. This is just the start. This is just the start. I do want to leave the workplace learning professional with a few nuggets with how does the workplace learning professional implement and measure the effectiveness of a learning transfer strategy?
Okay, the big questions, yeah, no holding back. I love it.
I know. Just go right there.
So I think there's 2 things. There's measuring the effectiveness and there's implementing. I think when you're implementing, you need to consider how close to the role is the learning. So if something is a real just-in-time learning piece that maybe someone accesses when they have an immediate need, that transfer is much easier and perhaps won't need the separate transfer strategy because they'll be implementing in the moment. But you look at something around leaders or your softer skills where maybe people are performing well but perhaps not as a high performer, and there's no sort of immediate needs. That's when it's harder for people to change their behaviors and it's more into the developmental piece. That's when you really need the transfer strategy from that learning, and think about the reflection and the accountability within that transfer strategy. So they're the key elements that people need to be considering. In terms of measuring the effectiveness, you really must have measures in place, even if they're very simple. So we've worked with must be over 7,000 people now around the world. As you say, 20 countries, very blessed to have an amazing team to be working with. But we can really benchmark the results and the type of change we will see from transfer. And every single participant we do with a very simple scale of 1 to 10 as to how they have moved with their objectives. Now, of course, you know, I've done work with Jack and Patty Phillips, the ROI Institute. You can take that all the way to the ROI, but as an absolute minimum, capture your data before someone goes on the learning, or at the point where they're making that decision of what they're going to implement on a scale of 1 to 10 for each objective, and then capture it again 10 to 12 weeks later. So I would say don't be afraid just because you can't get it linked to a business KPI in every case. Even just a basic metric, you know, is it heading in the right direction? Has it moved up 2 points? Has it moved up 6 points? It's still a measurement and evaluation, so don't be scared of it, would be my advice.
Absolutely. I love it. I love the fact that you're building that in at the beginning, because we know with evaluation, you have to start with the end in mind. Sure. And if you miss that piece and don't establish that baseline, it's going to be nearly impossible to show growth and progress in the development. And so I love that that's a part of the strategy in your methodology.
Yeah. And I love that we're talking about strategy here today, because when you have it as part of an overall strategy, that's when you'll get your best results, rather than after you've run an initiative, you think we're not getting the transfer, let's try and address it now. It's be way more strategic. So that's why I'm really happy that the conversation today is around the strategy piece of it. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Is there anything else you want to share about the strategy or the transfer of learning or your company? How can people get in touch with you?
Sure. So our website is transferoflearning.com. And we're really happy to chat with people. We've got a free action planning tool, which we've got a very big mission to make a difference to learning transfer worldwide. And that's at turninglearningintoaction.com. And anyone can use that free to help people action plan at the end of learning. And it gets emailed in a PDF form to the participant and whoever else's email address they want to share. So I share that because that's the first stage of learning transfer, get that individual to make a commitment. So, you know, Deadra, you and I sort of connected when I was across in the US. I'm more than happy to chat and, you know, share ideas, share experiences, and also hear from your listeners as to what their learning transfer experiences are. So, yeah, just please reach out via the website, transferoflearning.com. Love to speak with people.
So I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to chat with me about one of my favorite topics, and for being my first podcast guest, and just, you know, helping me spread the word and start and continue the learning revolution. So hashtag learning revolution, and I look forward to continuing our conversation.
I really wish you well with the podcast. I shall enjoy listening to. Thank you so much, Deadra. Best wishes.
Thank you so much.
Now it's time for Deedra's Learning Nugget. I want to take this time to explain this extraordinary learning strategy that I keep talking about in this podcast. In a narrow sense, a learning strategy is just what it is. It's an approach that achieves learning objectives. It can be individual or organizational. The focus of this podcast is on the organizational learning strategy, specifically extraordinary learning strategy. So an extraordinary learning strategy is tied to the mission. It's business focused. It's aligned with why does the organization exist? Your strategy, your learning strategy has to be aligned with that business need, or else it's dead on arrival. And I've seen it a number of times where people spend so much time working on a learning strategy or a learning event, and it's not tied to the mission. And so let me just point out a few things that are necessary for an extraordinary learning strategy. And there's 3 components. An extraordinary learning strategy has to be driven by business. Has to. As I said, if not, it's dead on arrival. You're wasting your time, your money, and your resources. It also has to be led by a highly skilled learning and development department, Whether you call it your training department, whether you call it your talent development department, whatever you call it within your organization, that organization that is focused on learning needs to be highly skilled. They need to know how to manage that learning function, and I'll get more into what that means in a second. And the third component is it needs to be implemented with the right programs. So it needs to be driven by business. It needs to be led by highly skilled learning and development professionals. And it needs to be implemented with the right content. I've given you some basics on what it takes to have an extraordinary learning strategy. In the next episodes, I'll dig deeper. We'll go deeper into what those components are. We'll talk about what your leadership development program should have. What does it mean to have the right content? What does it mean to have the right skills? How do you develop those skills? So we'll go deeper into the components of an extraordinary learning strategy. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. Let me spell my name for you because there's different ways to spell Deadra, although there's probably only a few welcomes on there. D-E-A-D-R-A. Deadra Welcome. You can also connect with me on my website at rescuemytraining.com. Thank you for downloading, but please subscribe to the Concerning Learning podcast.